All right, so today we come to Isaiah chapter 24. We'll be covering chapters 24 through 27. And as you recall, last week we dealt with this long section on the oracles against the nations and how each of them were going to be destroyed. So there's no point in putting your trust in any of those nations around because they're all going to end up going down, right? And in these chapters, Isaiah brings that idea to a climax. And we have seen this before, how at the end of a section, he will have usually 1 or 2 chapters, where he brings everything to a climax and often will look way into the future to the final consummation of the story of God. And that's what he does here. All of this destruction of all these individual nations, he generalizes it and talks about ultimate, complete devastation of the earth and the end of the age. So there are several characteristics that we see in these chapters. Well, actually, before I get to that, so Isaiah talks about the judgment of God as if it is a great triumph. This is God's finale, and it's a triumphant finale. Okay? And it leads me to ask the question, how do you feel about the judgment of God? And I'd like to take a little bit of time to discuss that. What are your feelings when you think about God's judgment?
It isn't good. I mean, it's it's scary.
It's scary. Okay. Yeah.
But it's also hopeful because it's victory over evil.
It is. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something to look forward to?
Yes and no. Depends which side you're on, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you have unsaved loved ones, that's a whole other issue. Because that's the end. They don't have any choice after that happens, and until that happens or they die here on earth, you do always have the hope that they'll come to a knowledge of the Lord.
Right. Right.
But even for the saved, the unknown part of it can be kind of scary too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Feeling good about the victory over evil, but how it's all going to happen.
Yeah, I could be a pre-tribber there.
Right. So this is a question to keep in the back of your mind because chapter 24 deals with the judgment of God, his final triumph. And then chapters 25, 26, and 27, we have 3 songs that basically talk about how the people of God respond to this judgment. Okay? And we're going to see various different ways that we might feel about this issue of judgment. So these chapters have a number of characteristics. First of all, there's a development by contrast. We see contrast all over in these pages, and we'll point that out as we go along. Good versus bad, a feast versus a pile of manure, and so on. So we'll see that as we go along. There are many references in this section to Genesis. And some of them are subtle, some of them are more obvious. There's a reference to the earth being under a curse. There's a reference to the floodgates of heaven opening up. There's a reference to the sea monster, Leviathan. And there's a reference to cities. Now this last one might surprise you a little bit, but you recall that as Cain went out after killing Abel, and he was judged by God, and one of the first things he did, he went out and he built a city. All right? And so the idea of a city is used a lot in this section. And so the city is generalized. It's not necessarily Babylon or Jerusalem or a specific city, but the city is seen as the dwelling place of mankind in the separation from God. So it's much more generalized concept.
The worldly city.
But you could say it's the city of the world,
Yeah.
or the city of man, perhaps. So let's take a look at chapter 24, where we see the triumph of God's judgment. And we're going to read quite a bit of this, but perhaps not all. Let's just start with verses 1 through 3. See, the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. It will be the same for priest as for people, for master as for servants, for mistress as for maid, for seller as for buyer, for borrower as for lender, for debtor as for creditor. The earth will be completely laid waste and totally plundered. The Lord has spoken this word. All right? So this is a very strong statement, isn't it? And he doesn't leave any room for question. That everybody is going to experience it. There's no way to get around it, and God has spoken. All right? Now, if we look at the overall structure of this chapter, we begin with the devastation of the earth that we just read, and then we have verses 4 through 6, the earth withering away. Then in verses 7 through 13, we have the song of merrymaking, which is silenced. And then verses 14 through 16, we have another song, the song of joy and glory. And then we have Isaiah is wasting away, verses 16 through 18, and finally the devastation of the earth, again, verses 18 to 22, followed by one verse about the Lord Almighty reigning, which provides the transition into the following chapter. So, as you see, as I laid it out in the notes, how these correspond to one another. The first is like the last, and the second is like the next to the last, and so on. So we have the devastation of the earth corresponds to the devastation of the earth, and so on. Let's read a little bit of this to see where we're at. So verse 4 says, the earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The exalted of the earth languish. The earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. There's another reference to Genesis. Remember the covenant of the rainbow? Okay. Therefore a curse, again, Genesis. Therefore a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore earth's inhabitants are burned up, and very few are left. All right. And now we have the new wine dries up, and the vine withers. So you notice back in verse 4, the earth dries up and withers. Now here the wine and the vine are drying up and withering. Same words. All the merrymakers groan. The gaiety of the tambourines is stilled. The noise of the revelers is stopped. The joyful harp is silenced. No longer do they drink wine with a song. The beer is bitter to its drinkers. The ruined city, here we are with the city. The ruined city lies desolate. The entrance to every house is barred. In the streets they cry out for wine. All joy turns to gloom. All gaiety is banished from the earth. So here they're crying out for wine, not in order to have a party, but to not remember. The city is left in ruins. Its gate is battered to pieces. So it will be on the earth and among the nations as when an olive tree is beaten, or as when gleanings are left after the grape harvest. So here we see quite a picture of devastation, don't we? Mm-hmm. And the song of merrymaking, parties and whooping it up, that's all gone. And it's utter silence. All right. Now, in that silence, then we can hear another song. It may be faint, it may be far away, but you can hear another song. Verse 14, they raise their voices, they shout for joy. From the west they acclaim the Lord's majesty. Therefore in the east give glory to the Lord. Exalt the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, in the islands of the sea. From the ends of the earth we hear singing, glory to the righteous one. Okay. But I said, Isaiah, I waste away, woe to me. The treacherous betray, with treachery the treacherous betray. Terror and pit and snare await you, O peoples of the earth. Whoever flees at the sound of terror will fall into a pit. Whoever climbs out of a pit will be caught in a snare. So, the people of God were praising, lifting up a song, but Isaiah is saying, I can't join that song yet. Why is it that Isaiah is not able to join into the singing here?
Because of all the activity of the city. The man-focused stuff versus the Lord-focused.
So do you think Isaiah was focused on?
No, he was still saying, kind of speaking for those who were lost.
Oh, you think he's speaking for those who were lost? Possibly.
Yeah.
Or
hurting because they were lost.
I think that's more likely.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
That's more likely. He was hurting for the judgment that he was seeing around him. Yeah.
Because you see the real contrast between revelry of the earth versus joy of the Lord.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So far we've seen a couple of different reactions to God's judgment, haven't we?
Yeah.
Right? We've seen the people of the earth going silent.
Okay.
Right? We have seen the people of God praising God because He is righteous in His judgment. And we also have seen, here the servant of God feeling for the judgment of those around him. Yes? So all possible ways of responding to God's judgment. So now we return to this idea of the devastation of the earth, the last part of verse 18. The floodgates of the heavens are open. Here we go back to Genesis, right? And the foundations of the earth shake. The earth is broken up. The earth is split asunder. The earth is thoroughly shaken. And here I love this picture. The earth reels like a drunkard, wobbling around. It sways like a hut in the wind. So heavy upon it is the guilt of its rebellion that it falls, never to rise again. Okay. All right. So, in that day the Lord will punish the powers in the heavens above and the kings of the earth below. So the powers in the heavens above was an expression that was used to describe both the stars of heaven and the pagan pantheon of gods that were often associated with stars. Okay, it was all the same terminology. But Isaiah uses the term to describe God's lordship over all powers who challenged him, whether in the heavens above or in the earth below. God is going to be the Lord of all. Verse 23, the moon will be abased, the sun ashamed, for the Lord Almighty will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem and before its elders gloriously. So, the moon will be abased and the sun ashamed. In other words, when the glory of God is seen, all those brightest things of the world hang their head in shame. Because they are as nothing compared to the glory of God. Now, chapter 25, we have one of these songs. 3 songs that talk about our reaction to the judgment of God. And this is presented as if it is a song that is sung around the throne of God. We just had on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before its elders, gloriously, the Lord Almighty will reign. O Lord, you are my God. It starts off. So let's read, perhaps Jeff, you could read verses 1 through 5 of chapter 25.
Yep. Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you and praise your name. For in perfect faithfulness you have done wonderful things, things planned long ago. You have made the city a heap of rubble, the fortified town a ruin, the foreigner's stronghold a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore strong people will honor you. Cities of ruthless nations will revere you. You have been a refuge for the poor, a refuge for the needy in their distress, a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm driving against the wall. And like the heat of the desert, you silence the uproar of foreigners, as heat is reduced by the shadow of a cold, or of a cloud. So the song of the ruthless is stilled.
Okay. So, chapter 25, in a large sense, is a celebration of deliverance, that the people of God have been delivered from the world that's around them. Okay? And it starts off in verse 1, O Lord, you are my God. Okay. So the whole song develops from this very personal cry. You are the kind of God I want. Right? This is the kind of God I want, the kind of God that is righteous and just and is reigning. That's who I want. And we also read that the Lord has done marvelous things planned long ago. So this judgment of God was not some spur-of-the-moment decision that God just made. It's something that has been part of His plan, His forever plan. So what are some of these marvelous things that God has planned? In verse 2, it says, you have made the city a heap of rubble. So all the works of human pride have been humbled. Okay? And that's a marvelous thing that God has done. And that leads people to honor and revere Him. In verse 3, strong people will honor you. Ruthless nations will revere you. The judgment actually brings about repentance and turning to God. In verse 5, you silence the roar of foreigners. The song of the ruthless is stilled. And this is another thing that God does. He stills the ruthless. You know, they're judged. Okay, now beginning in verse 6, we have a wonderful metaphor that Isaiah uses, which is why I entitled this chapter, The Song of the Feast. Because we read about a feast that God prepares for His people. So it was common in the ancient Near East for a new king to have an inaugural banquet when they came to the throne, and that's when they would bestow favor, and they sought to establish a very favorable tone for their reign. And so this is something of the picture that we have here, that God is going to start off His reign with this terrific banquet for His people. So, Holly, could you read verses 6 through 8, please, for us?
On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain, He will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove the disgrace of His people from all the earth. The Lord has spoken.
Okay. So Isaiah describes this banquet as a feast of rich foods for all the people. Now, what you think of as a rich food might be different from some other culture. In Isaiah's culture, they would have loved to have fatty meat and the marrow of the bone, and that would have been rich food. you might have a different idea. Isaiah says they have the best of meats and the finest of wines. It wasn't abstinence, I don't think, in here. But so what are the blessings of God that we see in these verses? God wishes to give out blessings, and how does He bless His people here?
He removes people's disgrace.
Yes, remove disgrace.
Wipe away the tears.
Mm-hmm. Which is referred to again in the book of Revelation, isn't it, at the end of the book? And what else?
Swallows death.
Swallow up death. Right. So death in the ancient Near East was viewed as this great big mouth that you would fall into and get swallowed up. And you can't help yourself. You just kind of keep sliding downhill into this mouth that swallows you. But in the end, the great swallower will be swallowed.
So if you go to Israel, did you go to Caesarea?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this
Philippi.
huge opening
Yeah,
in the side of the mountains. They thought that was the gates of hell.
Uh-huh.
That's where Jesus said, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So, and it really was a scary, dark.
It looked like a big mouth of a skull.
Yeah.
It was huge.
Interesting. Right. And notice the picture that Isaiah uses in verse 7. The shroud that enfolds all people, the sheet that covers all nations, that will be destroyed. The shroud of death. Yeah. You won't be wrapped up in a death sheet any longer. It'll all be gone.
Reminds me of that, where, O death, is thy victory? Where, O
Exactly.
death, is thy stand?
And it says, death is swallowed up in victory. He's alluding to this verse right here. So that's the description of the feast, and then the song that we started back at the beginning of this chapter continues on in verse 9. Just for one verse. In that day they will say, surely this is our God. We trusted in Him and He saved us. This is the Lord. We trusted in Him. Let us rejoice and be glad in His salvation. In other words, they are ecstatic and they're praising God for their deliverance through God's judgment.
It's cool how that's a repeat of Isaiah 12, which is often referred to as the Song of Isaiah, first Song of Isaiah. Surely it is God who saves me. I will trust in Him and not be afraid.
Yeah.
That's the same message, right?
It is the same message. So when it says that we trusted in Him, that, it also could be translated, we waited for Him. It's the same idea.
Yeah.
We waited for Him. But true trust places the timing in God's hands and it just waits. We just wait because we expect that God will act. And that's what trust is, expectantly waiting. Okay. So, and now we have some further description, verses 10 through 12. This is the contrast between God's deliverance and God's judgment. And he uses the word Moab here in verse 10, not as a reference to the historic city, to the historic country of Moab, but as a personalization of a general concept. That Moab was just a word that he used to stand in for all of the enemies of God. And so in verse 10 we read, the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain, presumably Mount Zion. The hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain, but Moab will be trampled under him, as straw is trampled down in the manure. They will spread out their hands in it, as a swimmer spreads out his hands to swim, and God will bring down their pride despite the cleverness of their hands. He will bring down your fortified walls and lay them low. He will bring them down to the ground, to the very dust. Okay? So, this is a tremendous contrast here, because the people of God got a banquet, right? And the enemies of God ended up in the manure. Right? They were trampled down in the manure. You know, I don't know how many of you have experience on a farm at all. Do you? Well, you know, we had cows when I was growing up, and you always had to spread out straw on the back end of the cows, right? Because then that would collect all of the manure, and then you could pick it up easier with a fork, right, and carry it out to the manure pile, or spread it around, or whatever you were going to do with it. And here we have Moab, or the enemies of God, being trampled down in the straw and in the manure, and perhaps it was springtime, because it was gooey and mucky and so on, and they were trying to swim their way out of it, and they were like this in the manure, right? And the more they tried to struggle to get out of it, the deeper down in the mire they got. It's not a very good picture, is it? A very effective picture.
Yeah.
Very effective picture of the judgment of God on his enemies.
My grandpa and grandma had a trail right down through the middle of their, where they milked their cows. And they had this big, it wasn't like a bucket, it was kind of like it was very long and scooped out, like a half a bucket cut in half, only it was very large. And that they put the manure in that.
Right.
And at the end, when they had done that, they would push it out and it would hit a post at the end and turn over. And there was the
The pile,
there was
yes.
a pile. Yeah, we used to want to ride in it.
Oh.
but of course it was stinky inside, and the chances of being tipped over at the end were pretty bad. But
Yeah.
once in a while they'd clean it and they'd remove that we did once on occasion get to ride.
Good.
Yeah, yeah. So, nice picture, Isaiah. So then we have another song in chapter 26. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. So here we have a song that celebrates the confidence of God's people. So first of all, God's people were thankful for their deliverance, right? And here we have a song of confidence, a song of security, a song of dependence from God, on God. And we start off with, "We have a strong city." So now this is not the city that we've been talking about all along. This is a city that God makes. God makes salvation, its walls and ramparts. So now we have a contrast. We have a contrasting city, another city. So this is not the city of the world. This is the city of God. Augustine would be very excited about this if he didn't already know this passage. Maybe he did. We have a strong city. God makes salvation its walls and ramparts. Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the nation that keeps faith. You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord is the rock eternal. He humbles those who dwell on high. He lays the lofty city low. This is the other city, right? The city of pride. He lays the lofty city low. He levels it to the ground and casts it down to the dust. Feet trample it down, the feet of the oppressed and the footsteps of all the poor. So obviously verse 3 is a verse that you have heard before, right?
Mhm.
You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast because he trusts in you. So this translation of perfect peace, literally it is shalom, shalom. Right? You remember how in Hebrew, if you wanted to say something was more of something, you would repeat it. Just like a little bit earlier in the last chapter, we had the Lord, the Lord. It's a way of intensifying and making it comparative. So God will keep us in shalom, shalom, him whose mind is steadfast. So steadfast means, has the idea of leaning upon something. We lean into God. So, what does this mean in our everyday life? You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast because he trusts in you. It's certainly true at the Last Judgment, but it's true in our life as well today. And what does that mean for us?
Steadfast?
Well, this entire verse I'm
Oh.
looking at.
It keeps us, if you know you can trust on God and lean on him, it reduces your anxiety and keeps you in peace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like steadfastness and peace go together.
They do. They do. Yeah, I was thinking about this this week, and you know, sometimes we have times in our life when we look at the situation around us and our circumstances and what has happened to us, and we say, how can this possibly be good?
Right.
Right? I know that in Romans it says, it talks about the good and acceptable and perfect will of God, but this doesn't even look good, let alone perfect, the situation that I'm engaged in, that I have around me. And it's hard to feel a sense of peace at that point, isn't it? Right? But I think that part of what he is saying here is that we look to God, and we have to come to the place where we accept that God's will is perfect, that God is sovereign. And when we lean into the sovereignty of God, that's when we have peace. The fact that Christians sometimes get all flustered and upset about their circumstances is really a failure of their theology. A failure to accept the sovereignty of God. And I don't say that as somebody who's just judging other people. As somebody who's experienced it and took
Right.
me 6 or 7 years to come to the conclusion that God was sovereign.
It doesn't feel good in the midst of it at times.
No, but that's
Yeah.
the way out.
Yeah.
That's the way out. That's the way. You will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is steadfast, who's leaning in on the sovereignty of God, and because he trusts in you, that you love him, her, and that your way is ultimately the best. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord, there we go, is the rock eternal. And God is going to bring down this prideful city, and feet will trample it. I love this. Which feet? The feet of the oppressed. the footsteps of the poor. The ones that were oppressed by this evil city, they're going to be ultimately the ones who are going to walk all over it. And then in verse 7, wonderful transition. About the feet of the oppressed, trampling on the city, the path of the righteous is level. O upright one, you make the way of the righteous smooth. Yes, Lord, walking in the way of your laws, we wait for you. Your name and renown are the desire of our hearts. My soul yearns for you in the night. In the morning, my spirit longs for you. Now here we have an interesting section. How can the people of the earth learn righteousness? And Isaiah suggests 3 different ways that the people of the earth can learn righteousness. Beginning in verse 9, the second half. When your judgments come upon the earth, the people of the world learn righteousness. Though grace is shown to the wicked, they do not learn righteousness. Even in a land of uprightness, they go on doing evil and regard not the majesty of the Lord. O Lord, your hand is lifted high, but they do not see it. Let them see your zeal for your people and be put to shame. Let the fire reserved for your enemies consume them. So there are 3 ways here that the earth might learn righteousness. One, Isaiah said, God can judge the earth, in verse 9. And that will, the wicked will see judgment and turn to God. And then God suggests that perhaps God can show them favor, in verse 10. Though grace is shown to the wicked, and Isaiah quickly says, they don't learn righteousness from your grace. And then in verse 11, let them see your zeal for your people and be put to shame. So God can demonstrate his zeal for his people. And that is a way that the world can learn righteousness. So he suggests 3 different ways. 2 of them, he says, people actually learn from, and 1 they don't. Does this surprise you at all? That he would say that people learn righteousness from judgment, and they learn righteousness from seeing your faithfulness to your people, but the world does not learn righteousness from your grace.
Well, I remember when the people of Israel were going into the land and God warned them that if things got good, if life got good, they were apt to forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's what happens when life gets good, is
We forget our need.
yeah, we do, and we become people of, well, we deserve this, it's ours by our own hand type of thing. We did this on our own, so let them do it on their own,
Mm-hmm. 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 I think the whole book of Judges gives that picture as well.
Yeah.
They when things were bad and the people, their enemies were oppressing them in one way or another, then the people would call on the Lord, and God would send a deliverer, and then they were living in peace. And then they would forget God, and they would go about their own way. And God would send in another oppressor, and they would call on the Lord. And this cycle happened over and over and over again in the book of Judges. Isaiah, of course, knows his Bible. But he had seen it, hadn't he? In Isaiah's time, the people were living, there certainly was difficulty on the horizon, and they could see that Syria was on their way, but yet they had just come through a time of peace with King Uzziah, remember? For 40 years they had lived in relative security and peace, and they had forgotten their God. I think that we see that in our world too, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And we can see it in our own life too. When we feel like things are going pretty well, that's the time that it becomes, it's easy to just kind of, ignore God, that things are going fine, and
from it.
We don't. No, we can get along ourselves,
So,
right?
you know, so find God. There's a great joke about a man who's up on the roof doing a roofing job, and he starts to slide, and he says, "Oh Lord, don't let me fall off this roof." And just then his pants caught on a nail, and he stopped, and he said, "Oh, never mind, Lord, my pants caught on a nail."
Didn't need you in the first place.
Yeah. When you hear that story, you feel like God should take his foot and just give him another little push, right?
Pull that nail right out.
Yeah. So what do you think about this? When God demonstrates his zeal for his people, when God shows his faithfulness to his people, is that a way that others can see God and can turn to him in righteousness?
I thought one of the reasons I came to the Lord was the couple that really witnessed to us. You know, they were working at the downtown mission, a street mission, you know, and we were just struggling to keep our heads above water. And, you know, they were just living quite well, you know. I mean, they were not struggling in any way. And yet, you know, he was depending on God's people for support because he wasn't, you know, being paid by these men he was ministering to. And, you know, it really did. I saw God blessing them.
Mm.
And, you know, I thought, oh, you know, they're getting blessed.
And one thing I saw was that people that the world might look at as not being blessed at all, but people who were living in the love of Jesus could still praise Jesus. I remember when I went on my Walk to Emmaus retreat, the leader of the retreat was a Vietnam vet who had no right arm and no left leg from being blown up.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw joy in his life, a lot more joy than what I was experiencing, and that was how he witnessed to me.
All right, so I just want to make a quick reference to Isaiah 27, verse 1. Really, I think this is probably should be part of the previous chapter in that it goes along with the same idea, the idea of deliverance. In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent, Leviathan the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. Now, admittedly, this is rather an odd expression. And I just simply want to say it's a concrete expression of God's ultimate triumph. And just leave it at that. This is part of it's a picture of God's deliverance of his people. Okay. Leviathan, or the sea serpent, was a common picture in mythology of the time of being something to be afraid of, right? And the God ultimately brings all of that to an end. Okay. Now, the final song in chapter 27, beginning with verse 2, is the Song of the Fruitful Vineyard. And this song is, in a sense, more meditative, a little bit more somber. And it's a meditation on the discipline of God. Okay. So verse 2, sing about a fruitful vineyard. I, the Lord, watch over it. I water it continually. I guard it day and night, so that no one may harm it. I am not angry. Okay, so let's just stop right there. So here we have this Song of the Vineyard that in some ways is similar to the song that we had earlier. Remember the song of the vineyard back in chapter 5, where it was quite a long section. God had planted a vineyard, Israel, and they weren't bearing any sort of fruit at all. And he said, I'm just going to tear down the walls and let all the animals and the briars and so on come in, and I'm going to destroy my vineyard. And so it was a song basically of the judgment of God. Now here Isaiah is using a similar picture, but with a very different meaning. God has this vineyard. He guards it day and night so that no one will harm it. And this is a fruitful vineyard. So it's not the same as the other vineyard. I mean, it can be the same people, but it's a different picture. And verse 4, he says, I am not angry. So when we compare this with the other song of the vineyard, we probably could say, I am not angry anymore. That God has found a way to satisfy his wrath. Take a look at Isaiah chapter 12, verse 1. In that day you will say, I will praise you, O Lord. Although you were angry with me, your anger has turned away, and you have comforted me. So God was angry with his people, and he judged them. But now his anger is, he's turning away from his anger. Now, it's not until the second half of Isaiah that we get more understanding of how God's anger gets turned away through someone who was the servant of the Lord, who bore the transgressions of his people. But we're just simply told here that God is not angry anymore. And then it says, if only there were briars and thorns confronting me, I would march against them in battle. I would set them all on fire. So it's almost as if God, the farmer, wishes that there were thorns and briars to come in, and he would beat them back. He'd like to be able to demonstrate his love for his people in this way. Verse 5, or else let them come to me for refuge. Let them make peace with me. Yes, let them make peace with me. It's kind of interesting that briars and thorns might come and make peace with God. That God is offering peace even to the enemies of his people if they will only turn to him. In verse 6, in days to come, Jacob will take root, Israel will bud and blossom, and fill all the world with fruit. So the whole world will be filled with the fruit of righteousness from Israel. So in light of the New Testament teaching, we must include all the children of Abraham, Jews and Gentiles alike, as members of God's church, who are involved in filling the world with the fruit of God. All right, now, beginning verse 7, we have a contrast between God's judgment on Israel and God's judgment on his enemies. In other words, does God judge his people the way that he judges his enemies? Verse 7, has the Lord struck her as he struck down those who struck her? In other words, has God struck Israel the same way that they have been stricken by their enemies? Has she been killed as those were killed who killed her? By warfare and exile, you contend with her. So God is judging Israel. With his fierce blast, he drives her out as on a day the east wind blows. By this, then, will Jacob's guilt be atoned for, and this will be the full fruitage of the removal of his sin, when he makes all the altar stones to be like chalk stones crushed to pieces. No azure poles or incense altars will be left standing. In other words, Israel will turn away from their idolatry. Verse 10, the fortified city stands desolate, an abandoned settlement, forsaken like the desert. So the picture that I see when I read this is that the people of God are in this city that has been destroyed. All the stones are torn down. There's no walls standing, and the only thing standing are the people of God. But they are still standing. God judged Israel for the purpose of discipline. He wanted them to learn, and they did. but God judged his enemies for the purpose of destruction. It was ultimate, complete destruction. And then, at the end of this chapter, we read that God restores his people to their rightful place. He judged them, and then he's going to restore them. Verse 12, in that day the Lord will thresh from the flowing Euphrates to the Wadi of Egypt. So from, from Mesopotamia all the way down to Egypt, wherever the Israelites have been exiled to, he's going to take sticks like you would beat on an olive tree to get the olives out, to drop. And he's going to thresh the nations, and the people will be able to return. God's going to gather them up. And says, and you, O Israelites, will be gathered up one by one. This is a very tender picture of God picking up the olives and bringing them back. So the whole purpose of God's discipline was for restoration. And that's not the purpose of his judgment of his enemies, is it? So we have a contrast here again. This is a much more somber picture, isn't it? When we think about the judgment of God on the people around us, we can't necessarily think that we won't be affected as well, can we?
Mm-hmm.
So what are the different ways that we respond to judgment that we've seen in this chapter, in this section? We've seen quite a bit.
Well, you said at one point they were silent.
They were silent.
Those are kind of people who are at the end of themselves.
Right. And the people of God rejoiced in the judgment,
Mm-hmm.
but they also were sober about that judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they knew that people were, they had come to the end. And when you look at the judgment of God, you also have a sense of dependence,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I am depending on God who knows the right from wrong. He knows the future. He understands it all. And I rest on his sovereignty and his control. And we also see that God does judge his own people as well. Not judgment for destruction, but for discipline. And that's part of his judgment as well. Okay. I think that we have to think about God's judgment as, when we think about God, we can't just think about God without including his judgment as part of our understanding of him. Because that's obviously an important part of his character as well. But we look at his judgment soberly and with an understanding of his sovereignty and of his love for us. Let's pray, shall we? Dear Father, thank you for giving us insight into how we should look at your judgment. And I pray that as we go through the various experiences that we will experience in this life, that we will continue to carry with us the idea that you are in control, that you are sovereign, and that your ultimate sovereignty will have a climax, and that it will be your doing. And there are so many questions that we have about the end of the world and the end of the age and how it will all come about. And while we want to study it and think about it and wonder about it, we ultimately place all of it into your hands because we know that you are good and that you care for us. We thank you for this truth, Father, in the name of your Son. Amen.